So, let me try to catch you up with some of the major economic events that happened in the last couple of months that I think are worthy of some analysis, at least to give you a perspective that's different from what you heard on the media. So I'm going to begin with the debate or the struggle or the conflict over the minimum wage here in the United States, because it's getting a lot of attention and an awful lot of strange things are said about them. If you look at sources of the news from the right, and by the right in this case I mean those industries that are concerned about the minimum wage because they actually pay people the minimum wage or close to it, and therefore would be impacted if you raise the minimum wage. They fund all kinds of research, some of it looking like it comes from academics or from so-called think tanks, but it's them who are paying for it. There was even a story last week in the New York Times exposing I believe it was called the Employment Policy Institute for taking money from the restaurant industry. Well, the restaurant industry is an industry that pays minimum wage in many, many of its employees, so they don't want that to be raised. Retail outlets of all kinds do that. Fast food joints have been doing it for years, and there's a whole bunch of others. So they will tell you the following story, and it's a sort of peculiar American way of dealing with these sorts of things. They decide that it's appropriate to tell you one side of an obviously multi-sided story, as if you can't imagine or wouldn't think of wondering what the other sides were. So they tell you the following story. If the minimum wage is raised from the current $7.25 an hour to something else, $8 is one suggestion. The president wants to raise it, if I remember, to $10.10 or something in that neighborhood. And other folks want to raise it to $15 an hour, which has been done already on the West Coast in the state of Washington and so on. The answer of the right wing is, well, then there will be an employer, lots of them, they suggest, who will decide not to employ a young man or a young woman, or for that matter, an old man or an old woman, because it isn't profitable for them to pay $8 or $10 or $15, and therefore all that you will achieve, here comes the punchline, if you raise the minimum wage, is deprive some people of a job. So you're supposed to conclude the minimum wage is better than no wage, and that therefore you should accept that logic. Okay? Now, is it the case, let's be fair, is it the case that there might be some employers who, if they were required to pay more than $7.25 an hour, would decide not to employ a person? Yes, there no doubt are such people, and they will do that. So, is it true that some people will lose their job because you raise the minimum wage? The answer is, yeah, probably some will. Nobody knows in advance how umpteen different employers will react. Some will decide not to employ somebody if they have to pay more than $7.25. Others are making so much money that they could care less and will continue to employ people and pay them more. And we won't know until months or years down the road how many of them there are. But is that the only dimension here? If you listen to the right, that's it. That's the story. But obviously, that isn't the only story. So let's just follow the logic a little bit. If you raise the minimum wage, then for all the people who now get more than they did before, because the minimum is raised to, say, $10, the whole millions of workers who got somewhere between $7.25 and $10 will now all get $10. They will therefore have much more money in their pocket at the end of the week, which money they will spend on all kinds of goods and services, leading the employers who produce those goods and services to hire more people to meet the extra demand that comes from those whose wages were raised. Therefore, in order to know what the effect of raising the minimum wage will be, you would have to balance those people who actually lose their job because the employer won't pay more than $7.25. You'd have to balance that with all the employers that are going to hire more people to produce the extra services that will now be purchased because minimum wage workers are earning significantly more than they used to. This is not rocket science. And nobody can tell you, nobody, except the clairvoyants who know what's going to happen in the future, they will. And for 25 cents at the local amusement park, you can ask them. But nobody else knows what the employment effect of raising the minimum wage is. You can't know, and no one does know in advance what it will be. But is the employment effect then, since it's unknown and uncertain, is it something we can measure? Yes. An absurd number of economists have written papers on the subject. They've looked at the raising of a minimum wage in the state or in the country, and then they've checked how has employment been affected. Why did so many people write this article over and over again? And the answer is, the only way to secure a job in academia is to publish articles. So the more articles you can publish, the better your chances of getting a tenured job and keeping it. One of the major causes of the proliferation of articles is the job situation of the people who write the articles. That's why so many of them repeat what so many of them have repeated before them. And that's why graduate students are tortured by being required to read something that was written in order to advance the career of the writer and for no other purpose. But it's also a hot topic. It gets a lot of news. And if you write that, and you write well, that increasing the minimum wage will cause people to lose their jobs, then there are public relations agents for a whole host of industries that will find you very exciting and pay you big bucks, much more than you get as a professor, to write that stuff over and over again and to appear on television to say it as well. But I've read a lot of these articles. I'm not proud of it, but I did. And I'm here to tell you that there is no consensus. Surprise, surprise. It turns out for every article that finds employment went down when the minimum wage went up, there's another article that shows you that it went up or didn't change much at all. Therefore, by the way, this is very good news for those of you that are looking for a career in academia, because it means you too can write such an article, get it published, because it's an open-ended, endless process. Okay? So, the employment effect of the minimum wage is a dead non-issue. It's junk. But of course there are other dimensions. And those dimensions are really less about economics than they are about politics and maybe morality. How do you justify paying a human being $7.25 an hour for his or her labor? What kind of a society does that? What does that condemn people to who work 40 hours a week? A poverty-level income is what it condemns them to. Do you want that in your society? Do you want people living under those conditions? A little bit of factuality for you as well. The high point of the minimum wage came in 1968. That's a long time ago. That is, if you calculate what the minimum wage then, in 1968, could purchase for you in the way of goods and services, it's much, much higher than what you get paid now. If the minimum wage had kept pace with prices since 1968, then the minimum wage today would have to be in the neighborhood of $11 an hour, just to keep pace, just to allow people working an hour to buy the same quantity of goods and services today that they were able to buy with the minimum wage in 1968, it would have to be $11, which means that over the last 40 years, a period of creation of stunning amounts of wealth in the United States, the people at the bottom, suffered a decline in the real wage they earned, a systematic drop from what they could buy in 1968 for an hour of their labor at minimum wage to what they can afford now. What kind of a society produces stunning wealth increases over 40 years while savaging the real income of those at the bottom? And here's an even more impressive statistic to keep in mind. Suppose the minimum wage since 1968 had been raised not according with prices, but according to the productivity of American workers, the increase in the amount of product a worker produced, goods and services, in an hour of his or her time. If you raise the minimum wage simply at the same rate that the productivity of workers, including minimum wage workers, went up. If you did that, kept pace, then the minimum wage today would have to be $17 an hour, not $7 1/4. So we have pushed those at the bottom down relative to what they were 40 years ago. The last 40 years, stunning growth in wealth, savaging of those at the bottom. That might be just as important a question to keep in mind when you think about the minimum wage as these absurd studies in which the right wing tells you jobs will be lost, and unfortunately, overenthusiastic left-wingers tell you, no, 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 jobs will be created. The reality is, we don't know, and that's not therefore a basis for making the decision. Second update, we've had some changes, big ones in the last 2 months, in what the Federal Reserve is doing, and indeed what the Federal Reserve is. Two big things. One relatively important, and the other one relatively less so. I'll start with the less important. The chairperson, Ben Bernanke, isn't the chairperson anymore. His time came to an end. And he was replaced by the vice chairman, a woman named Janet Yellen. And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about Janet Yellen, partly because she and I went to the same graduate school in economics at the same time. So she and I really are quite similar. I knew her back then, many years ago. We were both graduate students at Yale University at about the same time. And our teacher was the teacher of macroeconomics in the Yale economics department, a man named James Tobin. Some of you know because he got a Nobel Prize in economics a little while around that time. And he taught us Keynesian economics. And Keynesian economics holds the following: that capitalism, as a system of private enterprises competing with one another in a market, hiring workers, that was a system that was fundamentally unstable and likely to implode and destroy itself. Let me repeat that. He taught at Yale, and that was the dominant school of thought in those years, that capitalism as a system of private enterprises interacting in markets was fundamentally unstable and tended to implode and destroy itself if it wasn't saved from itself. For this, he got the Nobel Prize, or rather for his interpretation of the work of John Maynard Keynes, who was the inspiration for this way of thinking. Keynes argued, and Tobin taught, that the way to get the benefits of capitalism, which Tobin absolutely believed in, you would have to offset the self-destructive instability of capitalism by systematic government intervention. That the government would have to intervene by manipulating two things. On the one hand, the monetary system. The government should systematically manipulate the quantity of money in circulation and the interest rates we pay to borrow for money. On the one hand, monetary policy. And the other thing the government should do is manipulate the tax system and manipulate the quantity of money the government spends. That's called fiscal policy. That's it. That's what we were taught. I was taught that. and Janet Yellen was taught that. Okay? And that was the orthodoxy of the time. In our classes, as good graduate students, we often laughed. Good graduate students laugh when the professor attempts to make a joke. Partly this is out of gratitude that the professor understands the concept joke. And it's partly because that's the professor, and you damn well better laugh when he does what he thinks is a joke. So Janet and I laughed when he used to say there are actually people who believe that capitalism should not have government intervention. These crazy people are willing, in the name of preserving capitalism, to allow it to destroy itself. And the person we were invited to laugh at was a man, he could hardly express himself, Mr. Tobin. With such mirth was he filled. This man was Milton Friedman, and believe it or not, he had a job at a place called the University of Chicago, which we should always avoid. Well, I mention this because I want you to have a feeling for how much things have changed. A few years after that, Mr. Tobin was pushed out of his job at Yale. You didn't fire him because he was too famous, but you kind of pushed him aside, and he eventually went away, died. And that was the end. And he was replaced by people who had learned from Milton Friedman, who believed that the government was not only not helping capitalism, but was actually making it worse, and that capitalism didn't need the government, shouldn't have government intervention, and then everything would be great. Now, for Janet Yellen and for me, we looked upon this very differently. She, understanding which way the wind was blowing, went sort of with the wind. She never quite gave up all of what she learned, for sure not. But she understood that a career in economics in this country after the 1970s would not be advanced by talking nicely about Keynesian ideas. It would be advanced if you had great skepticism about what the government could or should do, at the very least. I developed differently. For me, it was always a question, my goodness, which is worse, when you let the government intervene or you don't? And I found it amusing that these two people were arguing which was worse, because for me, I reached the conclusion that why do we live in a system that is that fundamentally unstable in the first place, and then have a government which sometimes intervenes and makes it less unstable, and other times intervenes, as Mr. Friedman said, and makes it worse. I didn't find this a thrilling debate. I was more interested in saying, gee, maybe we could get a better system that doesn't present us with this absurd either-or. Why do we have this? It's interesting only because she and I sat in the same classroom, were taught by the same teacher, were taught the same material, and evolved into such a different way. She became part of the establishment in the United States. She's married to another economist who's also a Nobel Prize winner, a man named George Akerlof, who teaches at Berkeley, California. And so she's left of center in the sense of economics, which in other country would be called right of center, but in our country is left of center. But she will represent, and this is perhaps what's important, absolutely nothing in the way of any change at all in the Federal Reserve. She is Mr. Ben Bernanke, but with a different physique. She's a female. Other than that, I cannot find a major difference here, and it would be folly to expect any significant change at all. The other thing that happened in the Federal Reserve was a decision to taper. This has to be explained. Taper. This is really not taking in the seams of your outfit. It's a different kind of tapering. The Federal Reserve has, over the last year or so, been printing huge amounts of money, which doesn't distinguish what it was doing in the previous years, which is doing that too. But it was taking a new form. It was buying crappy mortgage-backed securities, giving good, fresh money to people who would prefer that to holding these flaky, uncertain mortgage-backed securities. And this was a way to increase the money supply, because that's what Keynesian economics suggests. If you have an economic crisis, a downturn, pump up the money supply, lower the interest rates so people borrow the fresh new money and make things happen in the economy. The Federal Reserve has interest rates, as you all know, at record lows. That's why your savings account is generating nothing. And it is pumping money in. And the Federal Reserve decided that having pumped in, ready, trillions of dollars in the last 5 years. The crisis begins, we didn't have $1 trillion of money on the, it's called the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. We now have almost $4 trillion, an enormous increase in the quantity of money. Huge amounts of money pumped into the economy to get it going again. And by the way, the fiscal policy, the President and Congress likewise pumping, spending way more than they take in taxes so that they can pump up the economy. For 6 years, we've had record amounts of fiscal pumping and monetary pumping, and we're still in the crisis because it turns out it didn't work real well. Didn't work real well. So the Federal Reserve, seeing that it didn't work real well, had a debate. Some people said, well, do more of it. But you know, we pumped so much money in, there's a kind of scary sense. What in the world would happen if that money that has been pumped in actually started being used by those who have it to buy things with? Goods and services, land, stocks and bonds. With all that money, it would drive up the prices of all those things a lot. We would then risk having an inflation, which is scary because it means if you have a fixed income and the prices of everything you buy go up, you're in a very unfortunate place. So the Federal Reserve, in its wisdom, decided, oh, we've produced all this extra money, maybe we should stop. So they've decided to taper off. That's what that taper means. They're going to reduce the amount of new money they're producing and pumping in. They're still pumping in new money, just at a slower rate. Instead of $85 billion a month, that was the rate, they're tapering down. $75 billion last month, $65 billion this month, and we'll see where it goes. Has this made a major difference? No. The so-called recovery we have continues to bypass the overwhelming majority of the American people. And in fact, what has happened is most of that money that the Federal Reserve pumps in goes into two places. Three. One, it is lent to the United States government because it's running a deficit. I know this sounds weird, but I'm going to say it so you understand it. The Federal Reserve prints the money, puts it in the bank, which uses it to buy Treasury securities, to give it to the government so it can spend more than it takes in taxes. That's the first use. The second use is to buy stocks. That's why the stock market has recovered. And the third use is to build up enormous cash hoards in the hands of banks and corporations, which are right now at historic high record levels. What has not happened is to use that money to buy goods and services and put Americans back to work in any fundamentally progressive or positive way. It just hasn't happened yet. If you look at the statistics for unemployment that have gone down over the last 2 or 3 months, the explanation for them, which everybody who studies this knows, is not that people are being hired, but rather that people are leaving the labor force. The reason the percentage goes down is that people who were unemployed last month have given up looking. And if you, in American statistics, if you are looking for a job and don't have one, you're considered unemployed. If you stop looking, still don't have a job, but you stop looking, you're no longer considered to be in the labor force. That's how the statistics work. Therefore, unemployment goes down when unemployed people give up. Just the way the numbers are held in our society. So the Federal Reserve is doing what it did before. Janet Yellen represents no change. And the failure of this monetary and fiscal policy a la Keynes to overcome this crisis is obvious. Last point. Keynesian economics, when it was taught to me and to Janet Yellen, was promised to be the way to avoid economic downturns. The government would see it coming. We have something called the Council of Economic Advisors, whose job is to tell the president what's coming so that he can undertake the monetary and fiscal policies to prevent economic downturns. That's what we were told, and we were told it would work. We're obviously in a crisis now, 6 years old, that prove that it doesn't work. It didn't work. The second thing Keynesian economic policies were supposed to do, monetary and fiscal, was to make sure that if a crisis ever happened, it would be short and shallow. Wouldn't last very long and wouldn't affect many people. By that standard, Keynesian economics is a bust again, because we're in the 6th year of what shouldn't have happened, and it is affecting virtually everybody. It's not short and shallow, it's long and it's deep. The only thing more ironic than to have serious people propose that we do Keynesian economics as if it could do what it promises to do are the people who look at the failure of Keynesian economics and draw from it the inference that we should go back and have no intervention at all. And that is the debate that engages our economists may explain why many of you find the field utterly perplexing and ridiculous. Next update. China is slowing down. The Chinese economy has grown like gangbusters for 25 years. I'm going to give you just one statistical sense of how to see that. Last month, when we didn't meet, the United States government announced with great fanfare that total output, GDP, in the United States had finally recovered in 2013 to the level it had before the crisis hit in 2007. It had only taken us 6 years to get back to where we were. Well, we're not really back to where we were because we've added millions of people in the 6 years, so it isn't quite the same economic thing to get back to where you were. But it was a milestone. We had gotten back to where we were. Over the same period, 2007 to 2013, the gross GDP, output of goods and service, in the People's Republic of China increased by 90%. 90% to nothing. 90 to 0. That's a measure of a difference of performance. That is a staggeringly different performance. That puts the ability of the United States to get back to where it was compared to another society that is 90% more wealth productive than it was back then. That's a staggering reality. And your faces all betray that I'm the first person to tell you that. Which has nothing to do with the reality, it has to do with your sources of information. Something fundamentally is happening in the United States. And I know it is now being recognized because literally an hour ago, I got an email alerting me to an interview available today on Bloomberg, the financial news, in which a reporter is interviewing Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs. And he is telling the reporter that the 21st century is going to be the century of China. This, which has been understood by an awful lot of people for 2-3 years, has finally reached Lloyd Blankfein. For him, this is really hot news, and you should have seen his face as he explains to the incredulous reporter this hot piece of information he's conveying. But if Lloyd Blankfein understands that China is where it's at and is saying so on the television, well, then maybe you can understand why it's worth pointing it out. But the Chinese, who have been growing at an incredible rate, 9, 10, 11% year after year, are now slowing down. Their current growth rate is around 7%. Okay, that's several times faster than we are, but it's only 7. And that means the Chinese can't buy goods and services around the world. They've been holding up the world economy because Europe is a disaster and the United States is not recovering. Stock prices, but not production. So the United States and Europe are not buying raw materials, metals, food from around the world the way they once did. But that's been okay because China stepped in. China buys everything imaginable to feed into its production, which is exploding. So if China slows down, there's nobody else to pick up the slack. The countries that have been kept afloat by selling stuff to China are discovering that they can't sell what they did before. And they have no slack, these countries. And they're beginning to crack. So keep your eyes on Argentina, Turkey, and a whole host of other countries that are in growing difficulty. The Turkish lira has lost 1/5 of its value in the last 3 weeks. Argentina is in a terror that it's going to have a collapse like it had a dozen years ago. Those were countries that counted on the world economy being held up by China. And as Mr. Blankfein looked around, it helped him to understand why it's appropriate to call this the Chinese century. Everybody's looking at the Chinese to hold up a world economy. So it leaves you with a little conundrum, not a big one, but a little one, which I would articulate this way. The center of world capitalism, New York, London, Paris, is depending anxiously on the fortunes of the People's Republic of China and its leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. There's some kind of historical irony there that you have to enjoy no matter what your perspective. At the very least, it's a world turned upside down. Next item, which is both a short update but also leads us into one of the major things I want to talk with you about because they've been in the news a lot. People have been talking about it. But I want to get into it by means of doing something different from what I normally do. I want to discuss a book. So what I'm about to do is in the nature of a kind of book review. The author of this book is named Thomas Piketty, Piketty, Thomas Piketty. He is a French economist who works in Paris. He's famous, and I'm sure some of you know. He does a lot of research with a fellow economist who teaches at Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, whose name is Emmanuel Saez, S-A-E-Z. And indeed, there's a whole website devoted to their research, Piketty and Saez, you can find on the internet, where a lot of their research is available. But Mr. Piketty has also produced a book. And the book is called Capital in the 21st Century. Choosing the title Capital in the 21st Century is a fairly unsophisticated nod to one Karl Marx. And Mr. Piketty is on the left end of things, not a Marxist by any stretch of the imagination, but more left than most Americans. Nonetheless, the book is a big success in France, where it was released, I think, a year or two ago, and it is coming out this month from nothing less than the Harvard University Press here in the United States. So it'll be released this month, or may even have been released already in the last few days. Here's Mr. Piketty's basic point. He looks at the flow of capitalism for the last 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 centuries, excuse me, 2 or 3 centuries, in order to get a sense of where it's going in the 21st century. And his examination, and he's a very famous and well-known statistician, among his other achievements, his conclusions, now widely studied together with those of Professor Saez, as really the best known and most frequently looked at studies of the distribution of wealth and income in capitalism, European, American, and so on. His conclusion runs something like this. The history of capitalism is the history of 2 numbers that do not grow at the same rate. Basically, what the history of capitalism shows is that there's some mechanism, and Piketty is not so sure what those mechanisms are, but there are some mechanisms built into capitalism that make the share of output going to capital rise relative to the share of income going to labor. That somehow in capitalism, the capitalists, their wealth grows faster than the total output of the society. And as a result, capital gets more and more relative to labor, that seems built in to the capitalist system, which for Piketty is a very profound understanding, seems to be true across the board in a variety of capitalist situations. This is a constant story. But, says Piketty, don't get all depressed, you dear reader, that capitalism has a built-in tendency towards growing inequality of income, and then as the income is accumulated, a growing inequality of wealth. Yes, capitalism shows it, but, he says, there are instances when political intervention can stop the process. There's even examples, and he brings them to our attention, when political intervention has reversed the process. Periods of years when the income of labor rose relative to that of capital. Workers grew relatively more wealthy at the expense of employers and capitalists. And so he concludes his book by saying, sort of, let's hope that people today will be responding to the growing inequality that capitalism is now typically producing with another political intervention that stops it, slows it, or reverses it. Now, I want to give you an interpretation of this book that's a little different from his. First, let me draw your attention, because I think it's very important, to one implication unmistakable of his book, that the normal tendency of capital, the book is published by the Harvard University Press, that the normal tendency of capital is to ever greater inequality. Capitalism is not a system that generates and sustains a broad middle class. Not at all. It's a system that normally eviscerates a middle class. You kind of know that because you're living in it. You're watching it. An item came across the news this afternoon, caught my attention. There are roughly 1,000 malls across the United States. You know, those ugly structures where there are a lot of stores and a place to park your car. About 1,000. 400 of them are considered upscale. That is a modern term for expensive. And 600 of them are not. The 600 are in terrible economic shape, collapsing, closing, dissolving, because they have all those stores for whom there are no more any buyers. The Searses of the country. The stores that are disappearing because the middle isn't there to shop anymore. Those 600 are the ones that can't rent all the space, where the shopper has been replaced by the delighted skateboard artist who now has a place to do what he wanted to do, and for other people doing things in the back that I can't discuss. The other 400 upscale are doing fine. And it's predicted in the pages of the retail industry newsletters that this situation will not change for the next 20 years. Came across Bloomberg today. The normal condition of capitalism is to produce growing inequality. Well, what are these political interventions Mr. Piketty has in mind? Well, the biggest one is the one here in the United States. In the 1930s, as we've talked before in these sessions, there was a massive political intervention. It really wasn't the intervention of the state. That would not be quite the way to put it. It was the intrusion of a movement from below. The CIO, the two socialist parties, and the Communist Party of the United States, who mobilized millions of people, got them to join trade unions on a scale we had never had before and that we have never had since, worked together with socialists and communists, who, despite their differences, collaborated in building a labor movement, and who went to the government and said, you either provide for us or there'll be a revolution. The CIO folks said, you must provide for us, and if you don't, then those socialists and communists coming right behind us are going to cut you a much worse deal. So you better. What they were saying in Piketty's language is, change the distribution of income. Change it. Stop where capitalism has been going. Stop where it continues to go. Reverse it. Or the game is over. We'll do here what they did in Russia. And Roosevelt did it. He basically bought the argument. And he was able to split off enough of the ruling class of the United States to go with him, that suddenly things became possible that had never been possible in American history before and have never been possible in it since. Again, because this story cannot be told too often. You created the Social Security system. In the midst of a depression, you decided to give everybody who's 65 years of age or older a check each month for the rest of their life. You created the unemployment compensation system, where you gave everybody who's unemployed a check every week for a couple of years. And you created a public employment program that gave 15 million Americans a job. And all of that, excruciatingly expensive, was paid for by taxing corporations and the rich. When I go around the United States giving talks and I get to this point, it was done by taxing corporations and the rich. People look at me as if I were describing, a phase of the moon. Something that only happens very far away and probably not really. But it's our own history. The taxes on corporations were raised through the roof. And as I've told you before, the taxes on individuals, rich people, were raised astronomically. In 1944, I love to tell this story, Roosevelt sends a message to the Congress and speaks about it in the State of the Union message. He has a new proposal for the top rate, 100%. Everybody who earns over $25,000 a year will not be earning over $25,000 a year ever again, because every dollar over $25,000 that you earn, you don't get. Or rather, you get it, and then you turn it over to Uncle Sam, or you go to jail. Your choice. Americans are very big on choice. It's your choice. The Republicans in the Congress, as I've told you, went crazy, which, as you know, is a character trait of Republicans. Not all Republicans, 2 or 3 don't do that. They went crazy, and they had a big fight, and yelled and screamed, and And a compromise was finally reached, 1944. so that the top income tax bracket on the richest people was 94%. Every dollar over $25,000, which would be about $380,000 today, every dollar over $25,000 that a rich person got, he or she could keep 6 cents, and the other 94 cents went to Uncle Sam. And the Republicans signed that, and the Democrats signed it, and that was the law. So any idea that there's a difficulty in taxing wealthy people or corporations should be referred to our own history. Why do I say this? Because an intervention was possible. Piketty's right. A political intervention was possible. But that intervention was temporary. It succeeded for 2 or 3 decades. The 40s, the 50s, the 60s. By the 70s, it was beginning to unravel. So we have really a question to ask that Piketty doesn't ask. Why did an upsurge happen that could reverse the inequality as it did? The 40s, the 50s, and 60s was the creation of the so-called American middle class. That's all. It was a short time, 30 years. A vast middle. Wow. And then it unraveled. So we need to tell that story. So here is a sketch. The communists, socialists, and the labor movement, they made it happen. They created a tax on wealthy people, a big one, and taxes on corporations, a big one. And the money was to be used to help them, the old people, the unemployed people, and those who would finally have a job working for the government because the private sector couldn't find one for them. Wow. Tax the rich to help everybody else. This drove the rich and corporations crazy. It represented the opposite of what America, for them, meant and means. And they didn't take it lying down. They were enraged not only that it had happened, but that they had been able to go to the president and get a friendly ear. And not only that, that the president pushed through the very tax increases on them. The president acted, oh my God, as the agent of the majority, which everyone in that group knew was contrary to how things are supposed to work. And by the way, what happened to this politician, Roosevelt, who dared to tax corporations and the rich to help average people? Did it destroy him? Did it wreck his career? He was the most popular and successful president in the history of the United States. He was reelected 4 times. No president had ever had that experience. He wasn't a pariah, except for people who couldn't stop him. And he was a saint for enough people that he walked into that office time and again. They had to pass a law after he died to make it only 2 terms that a president could have. Republican revenge. But the more important issue is that the corporates and the rich in America learned the lesson. I dare say they learned it better than the left did. We got to undo this. And the way we undo what has happened to us, taxed out of our minds to help the moocher class, the way to do that is to destroy the political organizations of those who made it happen. You've got to get rid of the communists, the socialists, and the CIO. So you begin with the weakest link, the communists, from being heroic strugglers who inspire, I don't know, The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck, or 100 other artifacts of that kind. You convert them from crusading champions of the working class into spies working for a foreign country. And you kill them that way. You deport a few, you prison a bunch, and you terrify everybody from having anything to do with them. And as soon as you're done destroying the Communist Party, you turn to the socialists and you say to the American people, you see those people calling themselves socialists? Don't be fooled. Socialism is just another way of spelling communism. I like to tell my audiences, I've always been befuddled as a teacher in the United States, why my students think that a communist, a socialist, a Marxist, an anarchist, and a terrorist, and now a Muslim are all synonyms. I used to wonder, yeah, in some parts of the country, add Democrat, that's right. I used to wonder, is that an uneducated population? And the answer is no, it has nothing to do with that. It's a terrorized population. It's a population that has learned these are all the same thing because they are all things you better not be, and you better not go near, and that are dangerous and evil and awful. But it worked. The right wing destroyed the socialists, like it destroyed the communists, and then went after the CIO and has systematically eviscerated them over the last 50 years. Just one statistic always sums it up. Less than 7% of the private sector of the United States is represented by a union. 93% of people who work in the private sector are not members of or represented by a trade union. That's the end of a labor movement. Or if not the end, just real close. So we don't have a movement from below. We don't have an agent to intervene a la Piketty to reverse where capitalism is going, and so we don't have any mechanism. And so the inequality keeps growing. So in the time that remains, I want to talk a little bit about why. What is that mechanism? And here I depart from Mr. Piketty. He does not use the apparatus I'm about to use, but it's the one that makes sense to me and that I would urge upon you for consideration. Why does it work this way? And basically the answer for me works like this. Wealth is produced by labor. Working together with machines on raw materials, we produce the wealth, the goods and services that come out of our economy. And most of that wealth is produced in the private sector, and most of it is produced in an enterprise, a store, an office, a factory. And in that enterprise, there's a relationship which is crucial to understanding where wealth comes from and where it goes. And that relationship is the founding relationship of a capitalist system. It's the relationship between the employer and the employee. The employer and the employee sit down and cut a deal. They do something. They agree on a job to be done, and they agree on a wage or a salary to be paid. And I want to focus you on that. It's not as simple as you might imagine. You sit down with your employer and you go over the details of the job you will do. The employer tells you where you will work, what you will produce, what technology you will use, what machines will be available, the pace at which you do it, the hours you're expected to arrive, and when you're done. And when all of that's agreed, you get to that delicate moment. How much am I going to get paid, you wonder. And a deal is struck there too. The deal, it's an exchange. You give your labor, your ability to work, and you get in exchange some money. And as I always do, I'll use a simple number. $20 an hour is the deal. At that moment, you must know, even though you may not have put it in these words in your own mind, you know something is true. You only get $20 an hour if the following is a reality. That for every hour that you work for that employer, your labor, your use of your brains and your muscles to transform the raw materials, your labor adds extra output to what that employer has to sell. He's got more or better stuff to sell because you're there. The more you add, what in economics is called value added, the more you add, the better for the employer. And the employer has a simple rule. What you add by an hour of your work has to be more than what he pays you. He'll pay you $20 an hour because in each hour your work adds more than $20 worth of stuff for him to sell. Because you know the stuff you help produce is not yours in capitalism. The stuff you produce is what you leave behind when you go home for the day. When it's 5 o'clock and the office closes and the store closes and the factory shuts, you go home, what you produced, what you helped to produce stays there. And sometimes some of you forget that. Take a little home with you. And then those people in the dark blue uniforms come and hit you with sticks and take you to jail because that's a crime. Your brains and your muscles go into production. You help to produce something that is instantaneously not yours. It belongs to the employer, who is intent upon selling it. He pays you $20 because your labor produces more than $20 for him when he comes to sell it. If that weren't the case, he wouldn't hire you. What would be the point? Give you $20, have you work an hour, you add $20 worth of stuff, which he then sells for the $20, which he's paid you. What's in it for him? Nothing. He really likes you, but he's not going to hire you if he doesn't get anything out of it. So he's not going to do it. At this point in my lectures, I always say something which my student audiences tremble. You probably won't. Here's the implication of what I just said. If you thought at any point in your life, proudly beating your own chest, I will never, you said to yourself, I will never work for anyone who doesn't pay me what I'm worth. You don't understand. You will never get paid what you're worth. That's not how the system works. You will always produce more than you're paid, because if you don't, you won't get the job in the first place. So you can pound on your chest all you want. This is the name of the game, Jack. In Marx's language, the worker always produces a surplus. That's where the idea comes from. It's a simple idea. The worker always produces more in value when he or she works than they get paid. That's how capitalism works. That's where the profit of enterprise arises. The capitalist pays the worker and gets back more. The capitalist buys inputs, machines, raw materials, but those just reappear in the output. The value he pays to buy them reappears as part of the value of the output. There's no extra there. The extra is labor, people working and producing wealth larger than what they get. No mystery here at all. But here's the implication. If the extra in every society is this more that all the workers produce, then the great question is, what do the employers do with all that more they get? They're the ones who get the surplus, the amount of output above and beyond what you need to pay all those workers who do the work. They've done the work, you've paid them what they demand, what they require, and you're left with a surplus, more than you shelled out. The profit, the growth of your capital. Wow. The question of the employer is, what do you do with it? What do they do with the surplus? And guess what, friends? That's where the inequality of capitalism begins. That's its origin. Of course, the employer could distribute the surplus to everybody equally. Wouldn't that be lovely? Then we wouldn't have inequality. He would distribute, he might even distribute it, this employer, a little more to those who get lower wage, a little less to those, equalize. Wow! This would be a guy who went to church and actually listened. But there aren't too many capitalists who do that. I mean, they go to church, they're listening. Something's, you know, they have a Walkman in there or something. They can't hear. They don't process it. So guess what? This shouldn't come as a major surprise, but for some of you it will. The capitalists who own the industries, the boards of directors whom they put in place to make all the decisions and keep these industries going, guess what they do with that surplus? They give a disproportionate amount of it to themselves. What a shocker. The people on the board of J.P. Morgan Chase during 2013 had to pay many billions of dollars to both the United States and other governments for activities that were either illegal, ethical, unethical, or both. That's what they had to do. Because their bank, run by a man named Jamie Dimon, did a whole lot of really crooked things for which they got caught and had to pay fines, huge fines. The board of directors looked at this behavior of their chief executive and gave him a $20 million bonus in 2013. They grasped something, which is, we're the employers, we get the surplus, we decide who gets that surplus, we distribute it. That's where wealth comes from in capitalism. It doesn't come from the really good basketball player or the beautiful actress. Do they get high incomes? Sure they do. But they are few and far between. The basis of wealth is the distribution of the surplus. And in a capitalist system, the surplus accrues to a very small part of the population who give as much of it as possible to themselves, and hence the inequality that's built in. Well, what's the political implication of this story? The political implication for me, and I'm not the only one, seems here pretty clear. Now I can figure out with this analysis what was the mistake made by the communists, socialists, and the CIO in the 1930s. Here's the mistake. They thought by going to the government and demanding that the government step in with taxes on the rich and the corporations and Social Security and unemployment compensation and a federal jobs program, that they had intervened, like Piketty says, and changed the distribution, which they had done. And now that was enough. That's the mistake, that last step. Enough? Here's what you didn't do. You didn't deal with the organization of the economy, with that employer-employee relationship, which means that you've accepted to continue to have the mass of people produce a surplus that those same employers as before get. And of course, what are they going to do? They're going to use the surplus you workers produce in order to destroy your organizations so you can never tax them again, and reinstitute the normal capitalism that makes them richer and you poorer. Wow. Well, what then should they have done? What is the lesson for the next phase of this sort of situation? I think it's the following: that whether the next phase is called Occupy Wall Street or any one of 1,000 other names, because the incarnations keep coming, even if the names change. What has to happen here is a lesson has to be learned, like we always learn from the things we did well and the things we made mistakes doing. The inescapable, for me, lesson in all of this: you cannot leave the organization of production inside the office, the store, and the factory the way it was. You can't make that mistake again. You can't do that. You have to fundamentally alter that situation, the organization of production, or else you will get what Mr. Piketty's research shows: a capitalism that will produce ever greater inequality. And even if periodically there's an upsurge of people who stop it, who even reverse it for a while, if you don't deal with that intrinsic relationship in production, the way every enterprise is organized, major shareholders, board of directors, and then the employees, if you don't change that, you're not going to undo the normal behavior of capitalism, which for centuries has been more and more inequality. And all you're going to do is allow it to continue another 5, 10, 15 years. Then we'll have a blow-up here in the United States. And then we'll do what? Another set of reversals of inequality without going to the root of the problem? So what then would the solution be? Here I want to make clear, because I've been using this word for some year or two now, and I don't want it to be misunderstood. What has to happen is that the split, the conflict, the difference, the division between employer and employee must come to an end. No more mass of people producing surplus for a tiny different group of people with them in the position of deciding how to distribute it. You don't change that, you don't change capitalism and the inequality it always breeds, a la Mr. Piketty and the Harvard University Press. What does it mean to get rid of the employer-employee relationship? And the answer is, you've got to make those two groups the same people. There is no way out of that. This is not some ideological import from some literature. This is the logic that emerges out of our own history. The people who decide on the distribution of the surplus have to be the same people who produce the surplus, because only then will they distribute it in a way that doesn't favor a tiny group of people becoming wealthy at the expense of everybody else. The way to make an economic system serve the people is to put the people in charge of it. The way to avoid doing that is to let the businesses be run by tiny groups of major shareholders and boards of directors while everybody else produces the surplus. This is not a complex idea. If it's fresh and new in your mind, that's about the education you haven't had, not about the difficulty of the notion or the difficulty of practically creating it. So the word I've chosen to use most of the time isn't this complex story I've told you tonight. I use a shorthand, and I talk about workers' co-ops. Why? The word co-op has a long history in the United States, and it's a history that isn't frightening to people. It's actually kind of quaint, a co-op. There's lots of co-ops. They exist in rural parts of the United States as well as urban. Indeed, from many of the earlier years of the United States, co-ops were institutions favored by the churches of the United States. They have a religious origin, particularly the Protestant churches, but they weren't the only ones. Long history of favoring co-ops, of even a suggestion that the co-op incorporates the ideas of Jesus, or at least the ideas of an ethical, sharing community. I like that. It means I can introduce an idea which is revolutionary in a language that makes it acceptable, or at least acceptable to listen for a while as it's articulated. But of course, like with every choice, it has its risks and pitfalls. I wanted to talk about them briefly. First, the word co-op covers a multitude of things, many of which I have no interest in at all. So, for example, I think it is charming that the folks in Brooklyn have a food co-op, a place where they can get together and as a group buy groceries, which then they can more cheaply acquire individually because they bought them as a group. Seems to me a fine idea. I would support it, but it has nothing to do with what I just told you. There's a completely different activity. I like it that farmers in some places get together and pool their output and sell it as a block. If you ever study the wine industry, you'll know that the people who produce grapes get together in co-ops, particularly in France, Italy, and other wine-growing countries, to market their grapes collectively because they can do better as farmers that way. Is that a nice thing? Is that a good co-op? Sure, I mean, I like it. Fine. It's got nothing to do with what I just said, because it's not about overcoming the relationship between the producer of wealth and the appropriator of it in production. That's why the term worker co-op or producer co-op or worker self-directed enterprise, these kinds of terms are precise and particular and talk about this crucial question of overcoming the dichotomy, the tension, the division between the producers and the appropriators of this surplus. A surplus whose distribution determines the equality or inequality any society has. If you don't change that, every other effort to fundamentally alter the distribution of wealth and income has either failed to achieve that goal, which is most of the time, or failed to preserve whatever progress it did achieve. That's what happened in the 1930s. That's why we're back now to the distributions of income before the 1930s ever happened. All that history erased. The people who produce the surplus have to be the ones who get it into their hands and decide what to do with it. Instead of an employer-employee relationship, the workers who do the work come together as a community to appropriate their own surplus. Since the idea that the workers as a community appropriate the surplus, become their own employers, receive their own surplus, and decide as a community what to do with it. Let me leave you with two thoughts about what that means. First, it explains why Marx, who figured a lot of this out, called that arrangement in which the workers become their own bosses, the workers as a community receive the surplus they produce as individuals, why he called this community appropriation of the surplus communism. Because I have root of that term, commune, community, in common. The few times Marx wrote about communism, it never had the slightest thing to do with the government. It's not about what governments do or don't do, or whether they're even there. It's about the organization of production, which for Marx was a much more important core understanding to focus people who were interested in doing something about inequality. Do I need to explain inequality? Well, I thought I might. So I thought I'd conclude by bringing to your attention, in case you missed it last month, a new report by Oxfam, which has gotten a lot of play. They wrote a report on wealth and its distribution in the world. And the report is titled, Working for the Few. Working for the Few. You can look it up and read it. And I'm going to mention just 2 or 3 facts from this Oxfam report. The combined wealth of the world's richest 85 individuals, 85 people, the combined wealth of the world's richest 85 people is now equivalent to the wealth owned by half of the world's population, 3.5 billion people. The 3.5 billion poorest, the poorest half of the world, together have as much wealth as the 85 richest people. That is an indictment of the capitalism of the last 3 centuries that has produced that result. How could you possibly justify, with what ethical rule or principle or imperative could you justify it? Second fact from the same report. Last year, 2013, 210 people became billionaires, joining a select group of 1,426 individuals who already were billionaires. Their combined wealth of this now 1,600 roughly people is $5.4 trillion. Okay? Last statistic. The richest 1%, notice how this argument about the 1% that was made popular by the Occupy Wall Street movement was so profound, not just so effective, but without kind of knowing it, touched so many fundamental realities. So here's Oxfam. The wealth of the richest 1% of the people now amounts to $110 trillion, or 65 times the total wealth of the bottom half of the world's population. Okay? The richest 1% have a total wealth 65 times larger than the total wealth of 3.5 billion, the poor half of the world's population. This is an economic system whose level of inequality is completely and utterly out of control. The UN declared during the last 2 months, since we were last together, that it's devoting a huge campaign, which it calls the toilet campaign. Why the toilet campaign? Because it turns out that something on the order of 1/4 of the world's population doesn't have toilets yet, not running water toilets, therefore suffering all kinds of diseases and rates of death that are terrible because you don't have that kind of sanitation. What kind of an economic system is this? How could you possibly justify this kind of inequality? It makes ancient Egyptian pharaohs, got to get my geography right, look like amateurs. What is going on here? And here in the United States, the statistics are comparable. Okay, it's the end of my time, but there is one more thing that came up over the last 2 months that I just have to comment on because it is so outrageous. Argument. Manufacturing is coming back to the United States. Article. Picture of a factory someplace that's hiring people. Look at that. Manufacturing in the United States growing. Are there some places where manufacturing is growing here in the United States? Of course. There always are. But manufacturing is on a 50-year decline. And that decline isn't about to be and hasn't been in any way fundamentally changed. And the reason it isn't changed is that same inequality we've just been talking about. You cannot have countries in which income is the level of the United States and countries in which that other half of the human race lives. Once you have the technology to move back and forth between these areas quickly in a matter of hours, and once you have the electronic communication means to control production and to observe production at a long distance. The minute that happens, employers, being who they are, will leave the area where the wages are high and go to the areas where the wages are low. They've been doing it for 30 and 40 years. They're just beginning to discover the joys of it all. They're making money hand over fist by doing this, and they're not about to stop. And the only real way that the United States is in any way coping with this, which you ought to think about, is by trying to recreate the conditions here that will make it less attractive for an employer here to go over there. In other words, reduce the wages here. And there's a little place in America that I want to end by drawing your attention to. Memphis, Tennessee. And the reason I pick it is because of the nature of the manufacturer there, because you all know the name. Kellogg, the people who make breakfast cereal and other astonishing substitutes for food. Okay? Kellogg produces Frosted Flakes in Memphis, or to be more exact, it used to. 300 workers in Memphis, Tennessee have been locked out, frozen out by the company, not allowed to go to work, because they refuse. They're in a union, the Bakery and Confectionery Workers Union. They get a very good salary. They've been working there for decades. They've had that factory there. But the company doesn't want to pay the salaries it used to, wants to bring in temporary workers, wants to push production into Mexico, which is now, of course, much cheaper to do that. The workers refused, and so the company said, okay, you can't come in, you can't work. And the company is basically saying, simple, either you accept enormous cuts in your wages, in your benefits, to be more and more like Mexico, or you have no job at all, and we will move all production to Mexico. Because of NAFTA, we can produce the cereal in Mexico and ship it here to the United States without paying any duties or anything else. That's what we're going to do. That's the reality. The reality is the labor movement is given these kinds of confrontations every day. And labor doesn't know how to deal with it, and so tries to cut the best half-baked measure, cut us a little less than you had planned. Sad, but it's the unmistakable direction. There is no return of manufacturing, and there will be none until the process we're involved in now, ending education opportunities, loading up our young people with debt, cutting the wages, cutting the benefits, cutting the Social Security, until that process makes it as cheap in this country as it has been elsewhere. And the process only makes more and more profits as the corporations substitute the cheaper labor for what they used to pay. It makes the story of inequality worse, even than it has been. If you detect a tone of urgency and desperation in what I'm saying, good. That's a purpose. Things are going on and coming to such a pass that there's a kind of explosiveness building underneath the surface. And it's not just here. You see the signs of it in Europe, you see the signs of it in Latin America. It's spreading. And it is going to blow up unless something fundamental happens that isn't only a reversion against and a revenge against what's happened, but learns the lessons of the past and goes to the root of the question. transforming the workplace from the adversarial struggle between capitalist and worker, employer and employee, to the community of the working people, both those that are at work at the workplace and those in the surrounding community, together working out a completely different way of organizing production and distributing the fruits of that production. Let me stop at this point. We have a few minutes if you want to ask a question or make a comment. The cameras are going to pick that up. So I'll just call on whoever has a mind to say something. Yes?
Thank you very much. It's extremely rewarding to hear the context in which you put everything. But when you mentioned Tennessee, I believe I read that Volkswagen had made an arrangement to manufacture non-union cars in Tennessee, and the government, the mayor and the governor wanted non-union because that is the only way they feel it can be kept competitive. Okay, that's one aspect. When you said Kellogg's, I thought Volkswagen.
Well, can I comment on that? Because it's a little different than that. What you have, it's a very important story. Volkswagen has been producing cars in Tennessee for quite a while, and in a non-union. It's not a unionized factory. Volkswagen has been doing very well, as it has been as a global car company. It's very successful. The United Auto Workers, which has been trying desperately for a long time to organize the automobile plants that used to be UAW when they were in Detroit, moved south to get cheaper workers that weren't in unions, and so they closed the factories in Detroit, which is why Detroit looks like a ghost town if you go there, and has all those empty factories growing weeds in the parking lot, because they all moved to the south, and then they moved out of the country. So Volkswagen, coming in from Europe, never went to Detroit, set it up in Tennessee, doing fine. The UAW had a brilliant idea. In Europe, Volkswagen is unionized all over Germany. Couldn't do anything in Germany if you weren't in a union. So long ago, Volkswagen worked out a way to deal with its unions. And they have what are called worker councils. And deals are worked out between the management and the workers. And those have worked very well for Volkswagen. The unions like them, the company likes them. Volkswagen has worked with them. So when the United Auto Workers came to Volkswagen, it's very interesting. Volkswagen said, okay, we know how to work with unions. We'll work with you here. We'll work with you. We actually think we get benefits out of working with unions, so it's fine. So an election was arranged because the US law applies. So you have to have an election. I believe it's this week, the election in the factory. And the workers will decide, yes, we want to be represented by the UAW, or no, we don't, with the unusual following arrangement, which is your question. The management of Volkswagen has told the workers, yes, vote for the union, fine, no problem. Nobody will be harassed about it, nobody will be fired about it, we're in favor of it, do it. So the workers were bid, at which point people not involved in Volkswagen, mayors, governor of the state of Tennessee, began an immense campaign to stop this, trying to get the workers not to vote for the UAW. And over the last 3 days, because they're losing their struggle, they threatened to withdraw from Volkswagen the subsidies given by the state of Tennessee and the city of Memphis, which is normal practice, to bring a company into your area, you give them big subsidies. They're going to take the subsidies away. And they make this really weird argument, we're concerned about competitiveness. Hello, the company, which will live or die if it's competitive, is happy to have a union. You, who don't make cars, are worried about what are you talking about? You moron, you're nuts. So what is the explanation? The explanation is political and economic. Economic, because the arrival of a fairly powerful union with a long history, like the United Auto Workers, with a real base in Tennessee, that means other union efforts are going to be happening in other enterprises, and that they don't want that. They're vulnerable. They don't have Volkswagen's mentality, they don't have Volkswagen's history, and they don't have Volkswagen's money. So they're very worried. But even more important, if the UAW establishes, it is part of the Democratic Party. It works with the Democratic Party, it funds the Democratic Party. And the politicians in Tennessee are Republicans, and they don't want it. So you have this bizarre situation that a corporation and the union agree on establishing the union, and the local politicos responding to other enterprises and to their own political careers are trying to stop it. Weird, but a function of this country. Yeah.
I want to talk about new technology and entrepreneurism. When Apple first started, all the employees were made owners of the company in a sort, and many of them reaped great benefit from that. What is the intervention that happens that stops that kind of idea among all these new entrepreneurs?
Good question. So let's go through it real quick. Imagine a group of workers, and we have them in America all the time, who quit their jobs. I'll tell you a story. I gave a talk not so long ago in Silicon Valley, around San Jose in the Bay Area there, for those of you who know the area. It's a center of a lot of high-tech industry. And the people I was talking to were a group of producers who had all quit their jobs. They were engineers who earned $200,000, $300,000 a year, software engineers. And they had quit jobs at IBM and Cisco and all those big companies. And they now gathered together in groups of 10, 20, 30, people of all ages, and they took their laptops and they gathered in somebody's garage or somebody's barn. And they had a rule. We're going to set up our own company. We're not going to have to wear ties and jackets, the men said, or appropriate ladies' outfits that we had to wear when we worked in that big company. We're not going to have some jerk supervisor telling us what to do who doesn't understand what software is. We're not going to be told we have to act a certain way, that we have to drive a certain car, all of which is quite normal in that area. We want to come to work with a Hawaiian shirt and Bermuda shorts. We want to bring our child, our toddler, our dog, and our Frisbee. We would like to also come high as a kite. This is what we want. We can't do that at Cisco, but here, in this barn, or in this garage, we can do all of that. And they are full of stories of how now that they're their own boss, that there is no hierarchy among them. That's how they talk. We're all the same. Monday through Thursday, we come and we work on our software project. Friday, we come and we sit around all day and have meetings where we decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits we all helped to create. And I listened to them, and I was polite. And they used the term entrepreneurial innovation. I said, fine. That's what you want to call it. Now, let me tell you a little story. And then I explained to them that they were organizing the following. That they had all voted with their feet against capitalism. They'd walked away from a job in capitalism and created a communist enterprise. A collective of workers who produce a surplus that as a community, that's what they did on Friday, they collectively appropriated their own surplus and decided what to do with it. You are, I said to them, and I was leering at that moment because I wanted to provoke them, I said, you're all communists, which horrified them because a majority were Republicans. They were Republicans, and they were distressed to discover that they had enacted Marx's argument. But now the question. Suppose one of these companies is successful, and many of them are, and grows, as many of them do. And the time comes that their orders are so big, they've got to bring more people in. That's the moment of truth. Because how do you bring them in? One group says, well, we want to preserve our little entrepreneurial innovation. which means the new ones coming in have to be equal to everybody else. They have an equal say. On Friday they have the meeting. The other one's saying, what are you talking about? We are the ones who worked the last 5 years to build this company, to build it from nothing. No, they're not us. They should be employees. We who started it, we are something, partners, some word, but we run it. They, maybe later, maybe after some years, maybe, but not now. That's a fight. And that fight goes sometimes one way and sometimes another. Sometimes the arguments of those who want to hold on to the collectivity win, and they bring everybody in as an equal. Other times, no. And if you don't, you're then on the road. Now, is it possible after a couple of years? Yes, there are examples of a couple of years those people are employees and then you make them partners. Okay, that is a compromise. But often it doesn't go that way. It spins off, and after a while you've gone your way right back to the capitalism from which you originally walked away. It's kind of remarkable. There, by the way, the story I told, the ideological awareness of what it is you're fighting, that this isn't just a question about your little company. This is really a world historical shift that you're about. If that were a widely understood perspective, then you might expect more of these companies to make a different decision at that moment of truth than they otherwise might. But in our society, where they think they've got an entrepreneurial innovation as they're proud of as Republicans, you can see the prospects for holding on to the communal quality here is slim. Okay? Yeah, ma'am. I'm sorry, I can't hear. A little louder. The big question there is it true that the government has been bought out by corporations? The long, complex, and detailed answer to that is yes. But it follows directly from everything I've tried to tell you. Think with me again, the story we just went through. If it is understood, Mr. Piketty's thesis from the Harvard University Press, let's assume that business already understands exactly what Mr. Piketty is teaching us. That they understand that if you leave capitalism in the hands of the capitalist, we're going to get more and more inequality. And that the only real counter to that is a political intervention of the sort that happened in the 1930s. If the business community understands that, if the wealthy understand their own history here in the United States, they could only draw one conclusion. We must do everything in our power to block and preclude the political system from being used to do what Mr. Piketty shows it sometimes can do. We cannot survive as capitalists in a system that enables periodic interventions that undo what we do. And one of the reasons we can't is there then might be people with the mentality I'm trying so hard to inculcate here that understand what the next step is, because they get it too. How do you have capitalism in a democratic society? It's not possible. They don't go together. They hate each other. The enterprise is a fundamentally undemocratic institution. The majority of people in an enterprise don't get together and democratically decide anything. They do what they're told. Somebody else makes the decision, whether you have the job or not, what the job entails, what you will be paid, how long you will work there, what technology you use. Everything that affects your life, you don't participate in deciding. That's the opposite of democracy. Not only that, the more unequal the society becomes as capitalism proceeds, the more, and that's what we're living through right now, the more the mass of people begin, as they slowly understand what's happening to them. Their kid has too many debts and can't get through school. Their children can't have a child because the financial situation makes it impossible. Their job is insecure. Their benefits are disappearing. Social Security won't be there when they need it, on and on and on. The more people get it, the more they're going to find their way to the only offset. What people in a democratic society like ours, even with the limited democracy we have, what we have is the right to vote. And they're the majority are the people and the workers. And sooner or later they're going to figure out, we might use the political arena where we are the majority to undo the economic system because it produces an inequality we don't want. Even if the people haven't figured it out, the people who run this society have. And so they have understood you damn well better control the politics or it threatens to undo what you have accomplished in the economy. So, of course, they buy the political system because that's what they don't have the troops, they don't have the people, so they have the money. So they make politics dependent on money, which is where they're relatively strong and the mass of people relatively weak. Especially if the mass of people are not organized, which is what they got rid of after World War II in the way I told you. You need to keep the people unorganized and the politics dependent on money. But that's not an accident, or that's not about the evil Koch brothers. Stop. This is a structure built in to this system. Democracy and capitalism have a very stormy, unstable relationship. Divorce is always right around the corner. They can't manage it. There are too many contradictions between them. Okay, one or two more, and then we're going to have to, yeah, sir.
Why don't these unions go overseas to where all our jobs have gone and unionize the people in wherever it's down?
They do. The question was, why don't unions go overseas where the jobs are going and try to do organizing there? Then they do the next best thing. They try to develop relationships with unions in other countries to kind of coordinate their activities, to make it a little less easy for a corporation to go over there. It's obviously in the interest of an American union to have strong unions in other countries, because the stronger the union in other countries, the higher the wage there, the less the incentive for a corporation to leave here. So there's a kind of logic of solidarity. But it would take a union movement that had that vision. It would take a union movement that had the resources. Try to remember, every time unions get weaker, there's less money coming in, so the union can't keep the same number of people on the staff. The union's decline over 50 years has eviscerated their political staffs, their power, their membership, their influence. I mean, you can see it in the election. The one thing the labor unions asked back in 2008 of Mr. Obama, when he became president, in return for all the people they helped him with and the money they gave him and the voter support they organized, was to give them what's called union checkoff, to give them an easier way to organize people than under the current law, which he committed to do. And he never did. He never even made the effort. It just disappeared. It vanished from the playbook of politics. And by the way, the unions then supported him 4 years later. Having not delivered what they asked for, they supported him again. And you can see why, because if they look at the Democrat and they look at the Republican, that's not a difficult choice. But you don't get much when you play the game that way. You'll notice that the Tea Parties are pushing the other way. They're not going to play ball. They're willing, up to a point, to go their own way and let the Republicans die if they don't meet the demands of the Tea Party. The left has not yet shown, from the unions on over, anything comparable to that mentality. They still vote the lesser evil, and the Tea Parties are not playing that kind of game. ALEC, like the Koch brothers and many, are one of the many, many organizations of the business community and the wealthy. Republican Party is another one, that push in their general directions. But they're just the agencies and the vehicles of the logic of this system that makes it, of course, appropriate to use the profits you earn to control the political system, because without that control, you can't continue to earn the profits. So you control the politics to get the profits and use the profits to control the politics. That's the way this system works. That's why it's so difficult for the left to break in. But lest that last point I just made leave the wrong impression. For most of the post-war years, with the assault on the communists and the assault on the socialists and the assault on the labor movement, the left in America had a certain right to say it was very hard for it to function because the police were on them and the laws were on them and the government was against them and so forth. But now, the last 6 years, with the impact of this crisis, the crisis that wasn't supposed to happen because Keynesian economics can handle all this, the crisis that wasn't supposed to last because we know how to manage these things and is now in its 7th year, the shock of the American people, to have all of this descend on them, that the things they thought they had won, they don't have. Not a job, not an income, not a security, not a benefit, not an education for their kids. Nada, nada, nada. This is taking its toll. And I can assure you, because I go around the country talking, more than ever before in my life, the audiences everywhere are enormous and enthusiastic. As I like to say to people, I'm not saying stuff different from what I said 5, 10, or 15 years ago. It's not me. Oh, I'd love, my ego would love it. It's me, I'm such an orator. Not at all. I'm telling the same stories I told before. Suddenly, people find them charming and interesting and worth listening to. That's not a sign of need. That's a sign of change in the population. And you should take a lot of heart and a lot of comfort from that. The left now has an audience and has a constituency. That's why the response, the polling, even in the most intense months of the Occupy Wall Street movement, showed a majority of Americans basically in sympathy. 1% versus 99% resonates in this society. That means the left has a chance like it hasn't had for half a century. And if we don't respond, it's on us. This is the time. This is the moment. This is the opportunity. The history of what's happening in this society is working in our favor. We need to generate the organizational forms and the arguments and the styles that will attract people. And we have to be very courageous. We don't know the answer. I won't embarrass you by asking how many of you, had you been approached by those young people in the summer of 2011, and if they had sat down with you and said to you, here's our plan, we're going to get dressed and get a tent and go into a park and live there for a while. Isn't that a wonderful strategy? Most of you, like me, would have said, cuckoo, not good idea, no one will give a crap. And we would have all been wrong, dead wrong. That was a genius idea. The left is now big and strong enough in America. There should be 20 of these experiments all the time. Then we'll learn what resonates, what reaches people in this complex society and makes them suddenly come together, begin to define a program. Could they have defined it better? Sure. Should they have been more organized? Yeah. This isn't interesting. In our culture, of course, we're having to start all over. We're not like Europe. Europe never lost the organizations the way we did. They can pull people together quickly. They know who their friends and enemies are. The networks are 50 years old. We don't have any networks. We call up somebody and say, would you come to the demonstration? And their answer is, hello, who are you? Not, oh, of course, because I've done that before with you and you've done this for me and we have an understanding and we're part of a circle. None of that exists here. We're starting all over because we were defeated. And like the good 12-step program, before you get yourself out of a box you're in, you've got to be honest enough to say, I'm an alcoholic. So we're a defeated left. But like defeated lefts in the past, we can do real well, thank you, by starting with an understanding of what happened to us and why it happened to us, which is what we just did for the last hour and a half. I have never been, just personally, I've never been as clear about the potential for fundamental change in this country as I am now. And I was active as a young student in the anti-Vietnam War stuff back in the 60s. This is way better than that. Much more profound, including many more kinds of Americans in a much deeper sense of what's going on. And it's not about a foreign event in a distant country with politics we don't understand. It's about right here and right now that we understand real well because we're living in it. And so is our mother, and so is our cousin, and so is everybody else. That's a much more solid basis for us than we've had for 50 years. And it's not a particular issue that affects African Americans or women or homosexuals. Those were all important struggles, and they still are. But this is something that we all share. This is something we can all get together, work with those other issues, but do something that has the power to rally the kinds of numbers and the solidarity that can make a difference. Marx was right. Whatever the causes of a change are, you're not going to win until the mass of working people see that this is what they need to do. We're on the way towards that now, way more than we've been in half a century. And the people trying to hold us back are weaker and more insecure and unsure of themselves than they have been. Mr. Blankfein figured out that China's real important today. This is not good news for the other side. This is not a sparkling grasp of the reality.
But how far away are we from having a network?
If I knew that, I'd be busy making one up. I don't. One last comment. Well, you've been in the corner a long time. Well, each of you, quickly.
Are you discouraged at all by the reaction of the elite class now that they have a kill list? Our democratically elected presidents are kill list. They're building detention centers that are empty now for future rioters. You've got police cars traveling in groups of 10 and 12 to riot practicing. And you've got all our emails and cell phones being tracked and stored. And does that concern you that maybe they're not weaker than they used to be, but they're actually preparing for this very moment?
They were strong when they didn't need those things. When they didn't need them. That's when they were strong. When the ideology was so strong and so settled that nobody threatened them, that they didn't have to imagine a scenario that would require a drone or a fleet of police cars or a detention center or listening to you explain your bad case of diarrhea to your grandmother, right? They don't need to do that. Why are they doing it? Because they're insecure, because they don't know exactly where their enemy is going to come from. They need to be prepared everywhere. They need to go fight a war in Iraq long after it made any sense, if it ever did. They have to stay in Afghanistan because the leader there has told them to go home and to get out. The leader they've supported for 10 years, that they put in place, has told them to leave. And they don't know what to do. And the Pentagon changes its policy every 15 minutes. So I see those things as signs of weakness. But in case you're intimidated by them, which is what they're intended to do, let me tell you a story. Famous apocryphal story, very short, promise. It's a couple of weeks after the revolution in Russia. It's 1917. And Lenin and Trotsky and the other leaders are sitting at the table awaiting Lavrenti Beria, an activist who was in charge of bringing to them the records of the secret police, the Tsarist secret police in the years before the revolution. And so Lenin and Trotsky are going through, and they get depressed. As they leaf through the pages, they realize that an overwhelming majority of the Bolshevik party was in the pay of the Tsarist police, including their highest lieutenants, many of them. So Stalin is real depressed, turns to Trotsky and says, "Oh my God, this is awful. Lenin, chipper as ever, says, no, no, no. He said, what it does is it shows you that when the wind is on your side, it doesn't make any difference how many police people they got. They lose anyway. Our job is to move this in a new direction. Then all of their equipment and all of their plans won't do the job. And the reason they're building them up is because they fear the exact same thing. Sir.
With American workers have a difficult time with slave labor abroad in general. Yet we have our own slave labor that exists in the United States in American penal institutions.
Right.
How come there hasn't been any program or any pilot program to link manufacturing to a prison, which the wages are already low as it possibly can be anywhere in the world? They have health care there, they have room and board, they have the manpower, and yet you can begin a training program that could cut down on recidivism.
Very important question. Very important question. Two answers. First, there is a growing, and it has to be called this, prison industrial complex. There is a growing number of private corporations that both run the prisons, more and more prisons are run by private companies, and private companies that bring prisoners in or bring the factory into the jail in order to take advantage of the terribly low wages that you've correctly described. So there is actually a little of what you're talking about going on. The biggest problem is this: there are no jobs for these people. This is a system that is unable to create meaningful work. It doesn't do it, and that's not because it's stupid or uninformed. It's in the nature of the problem it has. What is it going to do with, if I understand the numbers correctly, 2.5 million or roughly people that are in our jails right now? What are you going to do with them? The irrationality of putting them in jail is overwhelming. The evidence shows that going into jail makes you worse when you come out than you were when you went in. So whatever it's supposed to do, it's failing. It's not making you a better citizen, a more productive person, or any of the things that are said, number one. Number two, it costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000 to $50,000 a year to have a prisoner in a prison, and you could pay him significantly less than that in a decent job, and everybody would be better off, and you'd get the production out of this guy. So the logic here is zero. It's clear that we don't need it because no other advanced industrial society has anything like the percentage of its adult people in jail that we do. So unless you think Americans are intrinsically prison prone, then obviously something is wrong. Well, what is it that's wrong? Well, it's the same thing that's wrong with, it's capitalism, the same thing that's wrong with the rest of our economy. For example, and you'll see the connection. If it were true that we don't need 10% of the workers in our country that we have, that our unemployment rate, depending on how you count it, let's say it's in the neighborhood of 10%. So 10%, let's assume we don't need that. Of course we do, because we have to rebuild our cities, we have to provide daycare for children, we have to provide something for the old people. There's lots of work to be done, but put that away. Let's assume we don't have 10%, need for 10% of our people. The rational way to do this would be to say, hey, we can produce a certain standard of living with 10% less people. So the solution, the rational solution would be everybody does 10% less work. And that would give everybody 10% more leisure so that they would have more freedom to do the creative things they've been meaning to do but never had the time to do. That way we would all benefit from the fact that we can produce a reasonable standard of living with 10% less people working. You wouldn't, because it's crazy, say to some people, we're going to give you overtime, and other people, you're going to have nothing. You're going to be unemployed. That's crazy. That's crazy. Why does that happen? Because for a capitalist, this is terrifying. What are you talking about? Give everybody 10% off their work assignment while everything else stays the same? That would be good for working people, but there's nothing in it for me. That isn't going to happen. I'm going to be able to say to this person, You lose everything. You're unemployed, and you keep your job. I'm the kingmaker here. I'm the one who decides whether you make it or you don't. The same logic with prison. It's illogical. We're spending $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year to keep a man or a woman, it's more overwhelmingly men, in an isolation cell, which is more and more where we put them, destroying their mentalities, destroying them as human beings, when instead the same amount of money could pay them a salary of $30,000, $40,000 a year, and what would we get? A person who isn't in a prison, getting sicker or more twisted as a result of that experience, and a person who, being paid that salary, would be producing something for himself or herself and everybody else. We'd be spending the money and getting something back. Prison is spending the money and getting nothing except a damaged human being. It's lunacy. It's a lunatic way of dealing, and a society of reasonably sane people doing lunatic things is a sign that there's a system breakdown here. This is a system that makes reasonable, decent, intelligent people produce outcomes that are fundamentally irrational and contrary to their own interests as part of a community. We do crazy things, and that's a sign that a system is reaching its end. Come on. Final thought for today. Capitalism is an economic system. Every other economic system the world has known, communism, primitive tribal societies, feudalism, slavery, every one of those systems was born, evolved, and died, and passed on, and was replaced by another system. Why would you imagine it's any different with capitalism? It was born, Britain, 18th century, maybe 17th century. It's had 3 or 4 or 5 centuries. It's breaking down, is dying. Do we want to go with it? Or is it time to ask the question that should always be asked? Can't we do better than this? Can't we figure out alternative ways to organize our economic and political life that doesn't give us this display of dysfunctionality? A healthy society would be debating that, which we're beginning to do. The best parts of our society are asking and are wondering. And the worst parts of our society are making drones and camps to try to contain the situation. I think the betting, long shot as it may be, is actually on us. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next month.